Greetings, DA 8th graders. Well, you're actually more than halfway done with 8th grade, aren't you? So let's call you rising 9th graders. My name is Steve Goldberg, and I look forward to working with you on Monday to explore a moment that happened on July 8th, 1944. Did you know that right here in Durham, less than 4 miles from where you go to school, a white bus driver shot this U.S. soldier twice? The soldier, Private Booker Spicely, apparently did not sit where he was supposed to sit on the bus. Words were exchanged between Private Spicely and the bus driver, Herman Lee Council. When Private Spicely got off the bus, Council followed him. Council then shot Spicely twice. Spicely died on the street. After the shooting, the bus driver, Council, got back on his bus and finished his route before turning himself in. But he was not in jail for long. The Duke Power Company, which owned and operated the buses in Durham, bailed Council out a few hours later. And there's where I got that quote from. You can click the link if you want. This shooting happened in 1944, but I'm amazed, particularly as a history teacher, that I just learned about it a few years ago. Why isn't this incident more well known? It seems like it should be a big deal in the Triangle. I learned about Private Booker Spicely's death from reading a book called The Secret Game, a wonderfully engaging book that gets its title from a secret interracial basketball game played in March of 1944 in Durham. For you basketball fans, in 1944 there was no Atlantic Coast Conference, or ACC, yet. Duke and UNC and NC State were all in the Southern Conference, and the teams in the Southern Conference were not all that great, as you can see from their overall records. These are the overall records over here. And I'm not sure why Carolina played 10 games and other teams played fewer, but there it is. During World War II, many of the best athletes in college basketball were serving their country, but Duke's medical school had an unofficial team made up of players who had played basketball at Division I schools, but were now training to be doctors. The medical school team could probably have beaten Duke's varsity team in 1944. Indeed, it would likely have beaten many solid college teams in 1944. The secret game took place in March of 1944 between Duke's all-white medical school team and the black varsity team at what was then North Carolina College for Negroes. It would later become North Carolina Central. You may know that as NCCU. For context, this game happened 10 years before the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision that ended school segregation. Plessy v. Ferguson established the idea of separate but equal, which applied to most aspects of life, particularly in the South. And you may have seen this famous picture before. It's from 1950, and it's showing segregated water fountains, white and colored. Here's a summary of the book where I learned about Booker Spicely, called The Secret Game. On a Sunday morning in March 1944, most of Durham, North Carolina, was in a church. That's the way basketball coach John McClendon wanted it when his all-black college team from North Carolina Central, then the North Carolina College for Negroes, faced off against an all-white team from Duke's medical school. The game would be the first interracial college basketball game in the Jim Crow South, and it had to be kept a secret. McClendon even locked the doors behind the teams after they entered the gymnasium. And if you're interested in more details, you can click on this link here. The book, as you can imagine, is about far more than a basketball game. It talks about life before 1944 in Durham and traces the lives of many of the players involved in the game. It also talks about events after the game, which is how I learned about the shooting of Private Spicely in July. The secret game was in March, both of 1944. Let me give you some more context for our moment. Booker Spicely, a private in the U.S. Army, was on leave in Durham on a Saturday night in July 1944. He came from Camp Butner, an Army camp with tens of thousands of soldiers that was set up just north of Durham during World War II. So that you have some geographic context, I made this Google map showing roughly where Camp Butner was located, relative to Durham Academy. Please click on that map for context. We'll look at it a bit more in class on Monday. And I think Google Maps is a powerful tool you can use to learn about history. So please do click on the map and look around a little bit, but then keep reading. I'm not going to do that in here because it's going to be hard to do that in the video. So with that context, let's get into the story of the shooting as it unfolded on a Saturday night in Durham. 4 days after the 4th of July in 1944. Private Spicely apparently did not comply with the segregation guidelines about where he was supposed to sit, and that caused a problem with the bus driver. I've copied a few pages from the book, The Secret Game, for you to read. Start reading on the next page where Private Spicely says, "I don't see why I have to move back," he told them being 2 white soldiers. "In Pennsylvania, we pay our fare and sit where we please." So Private Spicely is clearly from Pennsylvania. Here we go. "I don't see why I have to move back," he told them. "In Pennsylvania, we pay our fare and sit where we please." The soldiers agreed. The driver did not. "Shut up or get off the bus," he said. "I thought I was fighting a war for democracy," Spicely replied. "But it looks like it doesn't work that way down here." "I don't care what you say or like," the driver said. "If you don't like it, come and get me." Hurtling through the tunnel of trees along Gregson Street with the sound of the cicadas rising and falling through the open windows, the precisely ordered world of the number 5 bus was about to explode. If you're not familiar with Gregson Street, it has a lot of trees along the side of it, and it feels like you're going through a tunnel. That's what they're referring to there. 29 years old, Booker Thomas Spicely was a cook turned military truck driver. And while he stood more than 6 feet tall and weighed close to 185 pounds, he knew as the bus neared the end of the line that the stakes had become very high. So did the driver, Lee Council. "If you want anything," the driver said, "come up front and get it." "You come back here," the soldier shot back, "if you want to see me. Come up here, I've got something that will cool you off." But when the bus pulled to a halt along Club Boulevard near Walltown, the small Negro neighborhood that bordered the hospital, Private Spicely suddenly changed his tone. "If I've done you any harm, bus driver, I beg your pardon," he said. "I didn't mean any harm with what I said." The soldier walked off the bus and onto the sidewalk. Lee Council followed him. Then he raised the .38 and pulled the trigger. The first bullet smashed through the soldier's ribcage and lodged in his chest. When Spicely doubled up and began to turn away, the driver fired again, hitting the soldier in the back. Hearing the shots, neighbors poured out of nearby houses, and while someone quickly called the police, no one bothered to run across the street to the hospital. It was for whites only. A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up, and the 2 officers knelt down beside the soldier and loosened his shirt and tie. Then, as Lee Council got back on board the number 5 bus and began driving back to the car barn, Private Spicely looked up at the darkening North Carolina sky, slowly bleeding to death on the warm, soft grass. The trial began on a Wednesday, 9.5 weeks later. I went to college at Duke. I've lived in Durham for most of my adult life, and before picking up The Secret Game, I had never before heard of anything about this story, this shooting. The whites-only hospital described above was the old Watts Hospital. It's now the campus of NCSSM. I wonder if students who attend there know anything about this shooting. One of the things I find most chilling about this story is that the bus driver shot Booker Spicely, the police arrived, and then they allowed the bus driver to get back on his bus and finish his route before turning himself in to authorities. This is a sad story. I'm glad that I can't picture these events happening quite the same way in 2018. I'd like to think that a jury today would at least deliberate for more than 28 minutes. You'll see below what I mean by that. Counsel of the driver claimed he was acting in self-defense, but given the research I've done, I find that claim hard to believe. I'm having trouble envisioning how these events played out in 1944, and I think that's a good thing. It means it's hard for me to imagine life in 1944. It means we've made some progress. As the book said, there was a trial, and it took place about 10 weeks after the shooting. At the trial, here's what the judge told the jury, followed by the result of the jury's deliberations. The next page is also from The Secret Game. So this is the judge reading. "The law of North Carolina is supreme," he said. "Justice recognizes no creed, races, or social standings. Equal justice must be done for all." Then, after carefully reviewing all the evidence that had been presented in court, Judge Hamilton added, "The bus driver is empowered to eject from the bus anyone causing trouble, but he does not have the right to take the life of a violator. It is up to you, gentlemen, to determine whether counsel's life was endangered to the extent that he was forced to use his weapon as he did." It did not take long for the jury to decide. After 28 minutes of deliberation, they found the driver to be not guilty. When Lee Council heard the verdict, he let out a big sigh of relief and smiled. As the Negro observers filed quietly out of the room, groups of whites came up to the driver and shook his hand, but the prosecuting attorneys remained seated. It was as if they had not heard, a reporter later wrote, while hearing. The judge's message was loud and clear. There would be no more the jury's message was loud and clear. There would be no more crossing of the color line. And if you did, you took your life into your own hands. The world might be changing, but segregation wasn't. This is a troubling moment in Durham's history. It also seems like a powerful moment for you to consider as you start thinking about life in America during the 1940s and about how World War II connects to the civil rights movement. This is the end of the reading, and now it's time for you to do some writing. Specifically, I want you to ask a question and provide 2 sentences of context about why you are asking that question. So what I want you to do to prepare for class on Monday is to come up with at least one question about this reading. Write your question down, and then write at least 2 sentences that explain why you chose that moment to wonder about. You can wonder something about life in the 40s. It can be about the basketball game or the shooting or World War II generally. You could also wonder about women and when they started playing basketball or when women started driving buses. Write about whatever you found interesting, but make it relevant to the 1940s idea here. For example, I wondered what happened when a black player first fouled a white player during the game. Most of the black players had never played basketball against a white player before, particularly ones from the South. And they had to wonder what the repercussions would be for pushing a white person. Some black players had played against white players in the North, but in the South things were different. So those are my 2 sentences following my question. Similarly here's my question. What did the U.S. Army think about this incident? And then I've got 2 sentences after that. I wonder this because I imagine the Army was not integrated yet. But Booker Spicely is still a private in the U.S. Army. Surely the U.S. Army will be upset that one of its soldiers was killed by a bus driver, won't it? So you get the idea. 1 question, and then 2 sentences that give context to your question. So click on this link here to fill out the Google form, and if you could do that by 6 p.m. on Sunday, that would be great. That will give me time to read what each of you wrote before we meet, and I look forward to our class together on Monday. Have a great weekend.